Hey everybody, it's the Trout and welcome to the episode of the Trout Show. Thank you so much for stopping by. You know, I've been a guitarist for decades. I love playing guitar, but my earliest influence on playing guitar is one guy. His name is Jimi Hendrix. That's why behind me sits a Marshall amp, and why on the floor right beside me is a wah-wah pedal. I can tell you the first time I heard Jimi, I'm just not going to go into all the details of it because it's been a few years ago. But once I heard him, he had me and he still does. And here we are 54 years later after his death and we're still talking about him because he was iconic. His music changed the rock history forever. And unfortunately, his life was cut short because he died at only 27 years of age. But the impact he had on that moment in time and for decades later, well, it's just unfathomable. Think about it. So today's episode, I got the privilege and the pleasure to talking to one of the great people that's worked for the Hendrix family for years. That's John McDermott. Now, John has been working on and finally realized one of the things he wanted to do is put a documentary about Jimi building his famous studios in New York City called Electric Lady. And he's got a documentary about it, and we talk about that. He talks about all the details about that. But he also has an album set coming out with it, a CD set, a lot of stuff coming out regarding this new Jimi Hendrix documentary. Let me tell you something. I thought I knew a lot about Jimi, but believe me, after I talked to John, there's a lot of things I didn't know. And believe me also that it's very interesting how Jimi put this studio together, how he had to raise the money to do it, and how he had the foresight to make it the kind of studio it is even being used today. In fact, the Rolling Stones' last album that was released last year part of it was recorded there. And there's a lot of iconic albums that have been recorded there. So John talks about his relationship with the great engineer Eddie Kramer and how he's worked with Eddie before. But enough about that. You want to hear the story about Electric Lady Studios in New York City. I had the privilege, and now you do too, to listen to the director of that upcoming documentary about Jimi Hendrix, a vision about Electric Lady. That's next on The Trout Show. When you started the documentary, the movie that you got out right now, was that your idea? Was it a combination of I know you've been involved with the Hendrix family for a long time. Was that your idea? Was their idea? Or,
Well, that was an idea that I had. Eddie Kramer and I had written a book a number of years ago called Hendrix Setting the Record Straight. And,
okay.
That was my introduction to a lot of the wonderful people that you saw in the film. And, since then, we've always had a nice kind of friendship relationship. And I just always felt that story, much like the story of the Jimi's Maui performance and Rainbow Bridge and all of that madness, I both felt that would make for great documentaries at some point. I think that the thing that kind of really pushed it all forward is when the Hendrix family was able to acquire John Veltry's amazing architectural photography, documenting the entire creation of the studio from rubble to finish. So, having the visual documentation, if you will, coupled together with all those firsthand memories, I thought that was the winning combination. Because it's one thing, you don't want people to think it's just all hyperbole. Shimon Ron talks about coming from A&R Studios over to Electric Lady at the time, and describing it as a dump. Or just when Dave Palmer says, Eddie Kramer's asked me to leave Ted Nugent and the Amboy Dukes to come work at this place, and it's a dump.
Yeah.
So, I think it was important for people to really get the sense of the scope of the job that they did to really transform this, bankrupt nightclub into what it became.
I think the thing about it for me was watching it and not knowing, which of course it was up to you guys to do it, the amount of problems that were involved with building the studio from the very beginning. And the fact that one of the things I was thinking about this the other day after I watched it, and I said, I saw Jimi in 1970. I bet he was out paying for his studio
that's probably the reason I saw him. He had to raise some money to pay for the studio. That part of it was amazing to me, and the fact that listening to all those people, because I was talking to a session musician the other day that's very well known in Nashville, and I said, how did you become this guy? You got to be good. But I said, and it still comes down to knowing people
Sure.
and being in the right place. So when they're talking about, Eddie's talking about all these people that come in, like the two gentlemen you just mentioned, and it's almost like, hey, can you come in and help? It's not like they weren't talented or something, they had something to do, but you had to be there at the right time at the right place to be involved. And of course, then looking at the studio, which you see some of it, you're like, I don't know if this is the kind of gig I want to get involved in. So it was that part was really interesting to me. I had no idea that it was going to be a nightclub, that Jimmy wanted to be a nightclub and didn't want to do the studio. Had no idea about that. And I think the other thing, and of course you know him, I followed Eddie Kramer for years because I think he's one of the most brilliant engineers around.
Mm-hmm.
Was watching him, and I know this goes back a while because of some of the people that were interviewed, like Buddy Guy, and that'd been a while back. Some of them were, it looked like. But listening to Eddie talk about and playing, sitting at the board playing, listen to the drums, listen to how good that. It sounded like somebody that was sitting there in 1970. I mean, to me, it was like the excitement is still there for him doing this. That's an amazing thing to me. I mean, after all the years and all the people he's recorded, that's what I got about that. But how long did it take to get all this together?
I mean, I think ultimately it probably was about 18 months. I think from really shooting interviews and the editing process. It was when we started. I think the idea for us was to try to be able to tell a story that brought the studio to its, really when it was surviving on its own feet after Jimmy died. Mm-hmm. So I think for us, we were concentrating on 69 to 71, 72 mm-hmm. as being, that particular period. So it just was a function of getting everybody available to do interviews and to make sure we had all the information that we needed. And but it was, when I say 18 months, I say that only because we're also involved with so many other things, you know what I mean, with Jimmy that, wasn't as if it was every day. This was what we were doing. Yeah. I mean, we had both the Maui film and this film kind of started, somewhat concurrently, and we would just kind of make progress on both projects. But, the idea for us with Electric Lady is that we were actually going to release it I think in 2022. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, the packaging in which it comes in, it's part of a box set that has either 5 LPs or 3 CDs, a Blu-ray, and a big book. Yeah. And Sony ran into all kinds of problems. Sony mistakenly didn't even announce that they something they were working on with Amazon kind of made it public as if it was for sale. So all of a sudden people were like, well, where is it? Where is it? And we were like, well, it's not even done yet. So there's been a bunch of little kind of crazy side things around the project, but for the most part, we just plowed ahead, did what we did. And, as I say, for us, the real key was the photography and making sure that all of the principal players, the key people you wanted to hear from who were directly involved with it, were all telling you that story. I just always feel it's how I did. It's what Setting the Record Straight, the first book that I did in 1992, was all about, was letting those closest to Jimmy speak in the first person. You then, as a reader, are at least getting that information. You want to hear from those guys as opposed to me, or another writer or someone like that, kind of waxing about what they think went on. I just think there's a power to hearing, whether it's the exhilaration or the frustration or whatever from the principals that were involved.
Let's go back to that time because I remember exactly the day he died. The Band of Gypsies album had just come out, and if I remember right, and I remember telling my best friend, the guy that was my best friend at the time, we both went to see him, and I walked in with the Band of Gypsies album, and I said, "Guess what? He's not with us anymore." And he goes, "Oh, damn it!" And he just went, we all got pissed off about it, and but then it was right after that, not too long after that, that the material was released. And I've always heard, there wasn't a lot of discussion about it, I don't think there was any, but at first there was a sense that I read that they didn't want to let the stuff out. That Jimmy didn't want to have all this stuff was out, okay? And I had a feeling at the time until I watched this that it was we all as a producers, I mean as a songwriter myself, well, you have a lot of crap you do that you just want, people are like, "Oh, it's really good," and you go, "No, it's not. I don't want to get out." But that wasn't the point that I saw. I mean, to me, it was like, okay, they were actually working on the next album.
Oh God, yeah. No, no, no.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that. I mean, I thought it was like here's the vault. Let's go out. I think he was on Warner at the time. I'm not sure who he was on at the time.
He
He
was, yeah, he
on
was.
Reprise. And
In
okay,
America.
let's make some money real quick. But that wasn't
No, no, no.
that's
Yeah,
not, I
Jimmy,
mean, that's what it appeared to me back 50 years ago. But
no.
now after saying it, was like, oh, he was actually working on this album because he brought in all
Yeah, I
these
mean,
people.
you got to take into account that Jimi Hendrix was a 27-year-old guy. He's top in his field. I was out there doing what he was doing. Nobody expected he was going to pass away.
No.
But I also think too, you got to remember that the very nature of the studio being the opportunity finally for him to bring over a lot of the material he had started in '69 and at other studios, and now fix it up, add to, remix, do whatever you want to do. Plus, as he started to do with a number of songs, just build new things right there at Electric Lady. So, his goal was that 2-album set. I think what happened to him posthumously was, unfortunately, his manager Michael Jeffery was the driving force behind the movie Rainbow Bridge.
Oh yeah.
And Jimmy's idea for a double album was scrapped. Cry of Love became a single album, and some of the songs that were intended to be on that record were held over and put on Rainbow Bridge. So, I think that's a valid criticism in terms of Michael Jeffery and that decision. But that's certainly not to say that Dolly Dagger and Roomful of Mirrors were songs Jimi Hendrix didn't want out.
Oh,
So
okay. Yeah.
I think that Jimi Hendrix was really very much in charge of his career. I think Michael Jeffery, his manager, certainly drove what I would say his touring, his personal appearances, by way of making sure that Jimmy was out there as a performer, was headlining festivals, arenas, things of that nature. But anything to do with his recording and the delivering of albums was solely Jimmy's responsibility.
Mm.
So, ultimately, no one can say, oh, this is what the final record would have been like, or this is what this would have been like. It's not that at all. I think it's really more that those closest to him, Jimmy, at the time of his death, certainly working together side by side with him at the studio, came together in the aftermath of his death and presented the material that was, the things that they had been directly working on. And, which isn't to say that Jimmy would have, one of the first things he and Eddie Kramer did was to go through all the tapes he had recorded really in '68 and '69 to say, yeah, I want to fix this one. I want to change this one. We won't do this one. We'll recut this one. So I just think they were early in the process, Rick. I just don't feel that, Warner Brothers had no say. There was no A&R guy back there that was in the control room at Electric Lady saying, okay, 6 songs done, 4 more to go. Like that kind of stuff wasn't happening in his world. So I think that he was a perfectionist, but he's also somebody that was completely in control of his music. So whatever that release would have been, had he lived, single album, double album, triple album, whatever he wanted, would have been entirely at Jimmy's direction.
And you think about what you said earlier, he was only 27. I mean, and he was iconic at 27, which is really, when you think about it, it's why who was it? The band Bad Company got that Shooting Star song. It obviously was about Jimmy. That's he was a shooting star. And you think about people at 27, and you think they're running a major corporation, and he's still. And I think the thing about it is that I always appreciated about him, he was over 100% in control of his music, and I think that's why you listen to it, and of course that you get Kramer in there, because that's where I started listening to Electric Ladyland, and put the headphones on for the first time and listen to music going back and forth across one ear to the other. Never heard that before in my life. And then I thought, wow, this is really unbelievable. But that was the sense I had at the time, because I was a huge fan. As soon as Cry of Love come out, I bought it. I think I bought Rainbow Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
I brought all that stuff that came out, and so that was the clarifying moment for me, was the fact that he was working on this other project, and it wasn't just, hey, let's make some money, because that
No, he was always ahead of his audience, Rick. Always ahead of his audience. I mean, what's interesting is that if you think about when he came, having to come back to America to establish his fame, by 69, you've got Are You Experienced and Electric Ladyland still in the top 10, because you just have, underground FM had now started to spread across the country, and now you started to have underground papers, and college kids kind of now getting excited about Jimmy. So you were seeing a growth. People think, I think sometimes, they don't realize that, when he burned the guitar at Monterey, that didn't become something until a year later when the film was shown. Today, of course, with cell phones and immediate, social media, people are like, oh my God, you won't believe what just happened. I just saw this guy set his guitar on fire. He was amazing.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen until the Pennybaker film came out.
It's
amazing. And I think what's
isn't it?
interesting is that when you think about Jimmy in 1970, you mentioned Band of Gypsies, and, you seeing him in an arena in San Antonio. The Woodstock movie had just come out in the spring of 1970, and he was really the focal point of that, really the guy closing the festival with the Star Spangled Banner.
Yeah.
That movie was an enormous global hit. So I think that, Jimmy, the headwinds from a career perspective were all behind him, pushing him forward. And I think had he released that record in the fall of 70 or in early 71, I think it would have been just as successful as the preceding ones. And, he would have continued in his life. I mean, had he lived to just have released that one record, I think the impact on his posthumous legacy would have been enormous. It would have changed things incredibly so. But, listen, as you say, this was a human being who lost his life at 27. And, that's the sad tragedy of it. I mean, we look at it now from a historical point of view and say, wow, there's some really wonderful things here. Here's the context of why you should appreciate them. But, at the end of the day, he would have been shaping them into something completely fresh and different that suited his creative pursuit.
And I think we've talked about this before, but when did you, obviously you were a fan, but when did you really get involved? And I think you told me at one time that you were asked to get involved in something. Is that correct? Or
no, I volunteered. The Hendrix family was in a litigation.
Okay,
I had written a book with Eddie Kramer in 1992 and 1993. Eddie and I came up with an idea together with Felix Carcano to create a tribute album to Jimmy that would generate scholarships, the United Negro College Fund in his name.
I remember
and so that record did that, and we felt we had done Jimmy right. We put it aside. We both went back to our own careers and did what we were doing. But ultimately, I did see that Jimmy's father's attorney was trying to sell the legacy out from under Jimmy's father to MCA Records. So I volunteered during that time and helped the Hendrix family for the next couple of years to win to help them win their rights back. And it was during that process that we talked about how to go forward. And Al Hendrix and his daughter Janie asked me to come on board and work with them. And it's just been a wonderful experience for me to be a part of music that is so important from a historical, cultural, I mean, really on a global basis. I mean, he's really such a unique creative force. So, to be involved in helping to kind of share some of these stories, it's really been a wonderful thing for me.
Now, had you known Eddie before, or were you introduced to Eddie?
No, Eddie and I wrote that book together. I had originally befriended Eddie. God, at this point now it's 40 years ago or so. But yeah, no, we just we became friends, and it was Eddie's phrase that, look, I was very much involved with Jimi Hendrix in one aspect of his life, but to tell the story right, you've got to set the record straight. That kind of became our mantra of doing this, and I, for one, wanted to hear from people like Eddie. So that was really our mission with that book, which was to then take it to Mitch, to Billy Cox, to Jerry Stickles, to everybody that was intimately involved in Jimi's life. Like, the book was not a typical kind of cradle to grave biography, but what it did is that it looked at his career, virtually 66 to 70, plus a lot of discussion of the first 20 odd years of his posthumous career, if you will, his posthumous releasing of his music, of which I had many criticisms. So, I think that was for Eddie and I, was just an important project to do. For me, it helped introduce me to so many wonderful people who were directly involved with the Hendrix legacy in different ways. And then, of course, having the opportunity with the Hendrix family to create these documentaries and do these projects, there was already, kind of a friendship and trust there to be able to go back to Dave Palmer and John Jensen and Andy Edlin, because, we had already covered ground before, and they felt I had done so fairly and accurately.
I think, too, it's interesting because the further we get away from his death, you would think, and this is what's interesting to me, you would think fewer and fewer people would want to be involved, want to know about him. But from the standpoint of modern music, as you know, because you got a tour coming up, it still is there. And I always think that more of what you just got through saying, as of course I'm a fan, so that's different than, and I want to know because I just want to know what's the details of all that stuff. But from a historical music, aspect, that's where things are different. Because if you're studying American music in the 20th century, he was a huge part of that in the latter part. So if you're just going to want to know a study about it, and you're like, okay, why did he become so big and all that stuff? And then you throw the studio in there, and I just, it's funny. I had really, until I watched the film, I knew that a lot of people had gone there to still use the studio after his death, but I had no idea how many, and and how many hits were still made there. And I was just watching something this morning about the Rolling Stones. I didn't know they'd recorded their last album there at Electric Lady. Part of it,
they've done a lot of work there. Yeah, sure. Well, but what's interesting about it is that I think what's fascinating about Jimi Hendrix, and here we are now, where 5 decades after he passed, he still resonates. And I think as a fellow fan, you have to accept that Jimi connects with people in a different way. For some people, it's just wearing the t-shirt because he represents something. Other people, they want to drill down and learn every guitar technique, or they want to understand, all those things, all of which are great. I mean, that's, I often say, if you dip your toe in the Hendrix water, Jimi's got you, because you're fascinated by what you see, hear, understand. So I think that, our job, particularly with something like this film, is to provide the information to people, because you could be as you mentioned, a fan, but yet at the same time not really realize, wow, so this also is another lasting part of the Hendrix legacy, is that had he lived, this place, you can't imagine what collaborations would have come from it, what interesting projects would have come from it. I mean, the very fact that it remains today a place where artists go, I think speaks to what the mission was, which was to create a safe, creative place where, and by safe, you really mean where you're not the intrusions of fandom and
Oh
business and
yeah.
things like
No,
that. You're
I
literally able to,
understand. I understand completely.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're able to go to a place and
Yeah.
create your music in an artist designed, and not just artist friendly, as for example the record plant was,
Yeah.
but an artist designed place which was intended to not only provide the best sound, but a working environment that people would feel comfortable in. And I do feel that success, like Jimmy himself, is kind of shrouded in mystery. The cool thing about Electric Lady is that it's underground. They don't give
Yeah.
tours. You don't know what's going on down there. You
No,
just know, oh
it's
yeah, that
kind of
was
nondescript now.
Jimi
It's just
Hendrix's place.
yeah.
Something's going on down there. Taylor Swift goes there. You know what I mean? So it's, you know what I mean? It's like that mystery is just like the mystery of Hendrix himself, where people are like, wow, if Jimmy dug it, it must be good. And I think that's kind of the carryover.
I also, as a musician myself, there's something about going to holy land of recording.
Mm.
I've been to Abbey Road. I haven't been to Electric Lady. I've been to Muscle shows, actually recorded there. There's something about that as a creative artist myself that just kind of gets your juices flowing. You
Well, you
can.
can't help but walk in Abbey Road Studio 2 and not be struck by the fact that, wow, this is where this, and it doesn't take anything away from the artists who are brilliant who work there,
No.
but there's a magic in that room. It's like, it's like they say, it's the chemistry, right? It's all of those things coming together. And I
Yeah.
think that definitely played a role. I mean, look, Jimi Hendrix made some incredible recordings at Olympic Studios in London.
Yep.
But the difference here is that, he now had the facility where he didn't have to worry about getting into Olympic. He now was the boss. He was
Yeah.
like, he's like, you know what? I got music flowing out of me. Eddie,
Yep.
Mitch, Billy, get on down here. We want to do some work.
And that's
That
the
would have
way
been great.
that's the way it works though. It's as a songwriter, you never know when it's going to hit you.
Right.
And so I'm fortunate. I can just come into my studio here and do which a lot of people do now. But back then you couldn't do that. You had to have a lot of
Well, back
money.
then, people think you were crazy.
Yeah.
They would think you were crazy. And even the idea, what's different here is that certainly artists had home recordings. So, John Lennon and Paul McCartney and those guys had like a reel-to-reel,
Yeah.
like a single reel-to-reel, something like that. Okay, fine. But I mean, to create a commercial recording studio, I mean, that was the risk, right? That's what he really leaned into, is like, okay, I'll be able to have the cutting edge facility in Manhattan, you know what I mean? But at the same time, I'll have a second room where that'll, substantiate the income that's necessary to keep a place like this flowing. So I do think that again, it's always, that's the tragedy of his loss, is that, it would have been amazing if you see what he did in the 10 weeks he had the place. Can you imagine what he would have done in 10 years at that place?
Oh, yeah.
You can't not think
No.
that if he's an A and Stevie Wonder's in B, that they're not going to say, hey, play on this, or what do you think about this? Or,
Yeah.
like, that's the exciting thing, man. It would have been amazing.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because there's a lot of stories of famous musicians that happening to them.
Yeah.
Where they're at Capitol, wherever they are, and somebody's in the next. Hey, who's in there? Oh, hey, come in. Hey,
That's right. Very true.
And that's the point. When it's always the magic. You never know when the magic's going to show up. And
right.
You can always put out a good product, but there's something. It's like being in a band. I tell people this all the time. The hardest thing for people, I wish they could feel the same thing I do when that happens a night when you're performing and everybody's kind of like in sync. There's just something extra that happens. And you can perform every night and do a good job, but then there's one night it's like, okay, there's some magic going on here. I don't know what it is, but there's some magic going on. So when you look at it from the creative standpoint, and it's right. I walked into Muscle shows, both of them, and a friend of mine, he's a tour guide down there, and he said, you're standing there and looking at the piano that so-and-so played on. This is where Aretha Franklin stood, or this is where Mick Jagger did, whatever. And you're like, okay, I know that's been a long time ago, but there's got something still here. And I was talking
to man, and look, if you go to Sun Studios, same deal. I mean, these are these legendary places that music we loved, took root. But I just feel like what's always interesting about Jimmy is that I think his past life absolutely informed his, a lot of what he did during his life. So I think the ability to not be able to record, to not be given opportunity to, you're just a sideman, you do that, here's what you play, and then you're out. Finally being able to have that opportunity to say, you know what, no, this is what I do. This is what I'm going to be able to do. I will be able to do these kinds of things here. I won't be told, okay, thanks, we got to get back to work. See you later.
Yeah.
I mean, I do really feel like he understood both sides of it. And so I do feel that going forward, that's what would have really been interesting about him as a producer, as somebody who, would want to offer his studio to other artists that he was intrigued about. That could have just been a writing session. I mean, today that stuff's commonplace. Come over to my place and do it. But I mean, Jimi Hendrix lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village. So it wasn't like, hey, bring your amp, we'll just turn it loose. I mean, now, as I often say, he built the music business. Today, it's a music industry.
Yes, it is.
So it wasn't as if he had his own rehearsal space. His, everything to do with Jimmy was in that building. His manager's office, everything was there. So you just had to, I think they did pretty well in the manner in which they tried. But I do think that, it's hard to equate it to today because there's so much more of an infrastructure that absolutely didn't exist in 1970.
No, and the thing about it, you didn't have who was the gentleman that lived across the street? And they'd call him up and say,
Dave Palmer.
Yeah,
Dave Palmer.
Hey, Dave, it's midnight. I don't care. Come over. We're working on something.
Exactly.
I live across the street.
But Rick, it's funny, when you think about how many people, when you think about a Metallica or anybody today who's, an arena size act, they have scores of people that are working for them in different capacities.
Oh, yeah.
I think with Jimi Hendrix, you're talking about such a skeleton crew of people.
Yeah.
And when Kramer started that place, it was him and 2 assistant engineers. You had Shimon Ron doing the technical side, but that's it. Like, there's no, this idea that there's an army of people awaiting to help and serve. That didn't happen back then.
Didn't exist back then, and even
No.
the lady that was the receptionist, the gatekeeper, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Oh, studio manager Linda Charlin, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was all kind of you. It's like I said there earlier, it's like being in the right place at the right time. And I think the other thing about Jimi Hendrix is the mystique that he still has. It's obviously gotten bigger over the decades, but when people like Paul McCartney talk about the famous time when he was playing a song and Eric Clapton's in the crowd and he whammied Bard so much they're like, can you retune my guitar? And it's like, even they talk about like this mystique going on, and it's Paul McCartney and Eric Clapton. So you're like, okay, that mystique will probably never go away. And the thing, and I know that you're producing the tour, that's what adds new fans to it. And I bought the album, what was it, about 10 years ago, where they had another one where they had a lot of performers play on it. Because I can't remember what it was on CD. It's been more than 10 years now, but it was, and they had a Axis Bold. I forgot who it was. I was like, oh my God, I never heard this version of it. But that keeps going. And I hope it keeps going.
The songs are the foundation of the. It's all about the songs. It's what connects generation after generation.
Yep.
The guitar, certainly in his voice, his diction, the rhythm of his presentation, all those things. He's an amazing performer. So even if you just see a visual clip of him, you're like, whoa, what's that? So I do think that there are a lot of ways that he draws you in, but it's all, I think it's about and from his music and his talent. So that, from a purity perspective, is why people see him as a very special, unmanufactured, like he's a very real, genuine article, and of which there's still a lot of mystery about, because he wasn't a self-promoter. He really didn't do a lot of interviews. He really wasn't the kind of person, particularly if you measure someone of his stature to a contemporary celebrity today. I mean, he's the polar opposite of it. So I do think that's part of it, is that people are allowed to come to it fresh and freely, and they realize, wow, I like this guy because of this. And so that connection that they make, it's as almost as if they were making it in 67, 8, 70, whenever, when people like yourself happened on a Jimmy and were like, wow, this is unique and cool. I like this.
Well, and you're right, because if it wasn't for Dick Cavett show that he came on, we'd probably never see hardly any interviews from him.
That's right. I mean, he certainly did them. He did them when he launched his career, when Chaz Chandler was his manager, and they were definitely trying to get a foothold. But you're exactly right. I mean, and even Jimmy, he did the Tonight Show with Flip Wilson. He did the 2 Cavett appearances in America. At any of those, he played, at every one of those, I should say, he played songs that weren't on an album. So, again, it just wasn't him saying, hey, here's my new single. He could have just gone up there, banged out Purple Haze and said, thank you very much. But no, he was always about like, here's where I am in this moment. I'm going to share that moment with you, which I always thought was very endearing and fascinating. Like, wow, this was a guy who's just not up there to say, hey, buy my single.
No, and you know what else is funny too, talking about major acts nowadays? The clothes he wore. I mean, now it'd be like they'd be out selling him. I got such and such album, outfit on. I mean, they'd all be selling. I want to put Versace on him, or something like that. And you look at it and you're going, what kind of weird crap is that he's wearing? But it looks good on it. Why? And so,
well, Billy Cox told me a funny thing once. He said, when they started playing live shows, he said, hey, you gotta look good. He says, I like to wear these kinds of things. And he says, because remember, you and me, we'd be sitting in the back row and we still want to see the star. So I just think he understood it from both sides, which was fascinating. Like he knew what it was like to have to wear the suit and do the steps and do all that stuff. I mean, this wasn't like stuff you heard, some old cat on a tour bus yakking about. This was like, him being able to say to Mitch and Noel, or Mitch and Billy, like, oh God, when I was with Little Richard, I had to do this. Or when I was with this guy, I had to do this. So
I've seen the suits. I've seen the suits and the hair slicked back. Oh yeah, we've seen all that. Sure. But the other thing too, people don't know or don't remember, he was a paratrooper.
But again, when I say both sides, it's really, this is what you're talking about. And this is a guy, you're right, who served in the armed services, who struggled in Harlem, for example, trying to join the Chitlin circuit and really be a more active part of it, but yet at the same time said, look, I'm going to get down to Greenwich Village, there's opportunity there. And then when Greenwich Village didn't really pan out and you met Chaz Chandler says, come to England, there's opportunity there. Okay, I'll go. We're going to go back to America now. Okay, I'll go. Fearless. Yeah. Like I trust my talent. I finally now have somebody who believes in me. And I think that the strength of that was an enormous engine to propel him forward.
I never thought about that, but you're right. We all need somebody to believe in us.
Chaz Chandler's the hero of the story for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think he, musician to musician, it had to mean a great deal to Jimmy. When Chaz, who, was coming off of 10 top 40 hits with the Animals.
Yeah, he was big.
He's an artist of greater talent than his own and says, I want to produce you. I know that I can have success with you.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody talked like that to Jimi Hendrix at that time. I mean, nobody. This is a guy, as you hear in our film, jamming for free hamburgers at the Night Owl because, they were broke. And I just think that's, you can't underestimate finally having somebody who believes in your talent.
Oh, no.
and the impact that person can have on your life and career.
And that's why I do what I do, John, is to try to get independent talent that I know is good and try to introduce them to people that can make it to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
Because the fact is, I hear it and I go, okay. And it's just like anything else. I might interview 100 people and two are really at the top. You're going, okay, they're going places. And if you can just give them that introduction, maybe that'll do something. I don't get anything out of it, just see them be successful. And that's part of it. But you're right. When somebody believes in you like that, it makes a big difference. And I think the thing is with Jimmy, it was such a short time, but he made such a huge impact. And to think about this, and I know we talked before, but if you went back in time and said to Jimmy, hey, 50 years from now, they're going to still be playing Voodoo Child, or, he'd just go, no, they won't. I mean,
I don't know. I mean, you remember, blues was his root music, and he
yeah, I
loved.
know.
I mean,
Yeah.
he'd be listening to Robert Johnson. That was, 1930s. So,
Yep.
I know what you're saying, Rick. Believe me, I just think that, I think he was uncomfortable with adulation and
Yep.
praise and things like that, because I think he saw himself as still an unfinished piece of work, piece of talent. I think he knew that he needed to continue to grow and be better. But I don't know. I think he took pride in the work that he did. I think the gift of opportunity wasn't wasted with that guy. I mean, why we've been able to release so much music over the years, it isn't because of magic. It's because this guy said, I may never be able to get into a studio like this again. I'm getting in there and I'm going to just work,
Yeah.
work, work.
Yeah.
Did that in the record plant, did that at Electric Lady, he was going to make sure that he developed his music. And that was, his prime drive, his prime focus. So I think he was proud of the work he was doing, excited by it, frustrated by it. But at the same time, he had to understand that he certainly knew that 4 years before, these opportunities were non-existent.
That's right.
So if this was what you had to do to be able to get to here, then, it's just like he did with his royalties. He bet on himself and said, okay, I'll give 500,000 of my future royalties, which in $1970 was
That's
enormous.
a lot of money. That's a lot of money.
And by August of 70, he'd already made the first payment of 50,000. So, he wasn't struggling. I mean, he was still a huge artist that I just felt like he, knew that I can do this. I can get through this. So sadly, of course, he passed away, and, that changed everything. But I think that the idea that he had made that first payment and was already kind of still, now looking forward to the ultimate completion of the next record, that was a big driver for him.
Well, and you think about $1 million studio in today's dollars. I saw the other day the list of I've seen it before, but I actually looked at it this time. Woodstock, how they all got paid, how much each one of them got paid. He was at the top.
He was, yeah.
And I think it was $18,000, something like that, but it equated like $150,000 now. It was a huge number. So you take the $1 million, and now it'd be a lot, and people are like, you're crazy. Let me ask you a question real quick. Let me
just ask this one quick follow-up. Remember that, yes, Woodstock, because of its unique nature, he only got the 18,000 only, I should say. He was the highest paid performer.
Yes, he was.
But, when he would play the LA Forum, he'd make 100,000. He'd make 85,000 at Madison Square Garden, at these kind of places. So, he was certainly somebody that had drawing power and an economic finance. Had Noel not left the band in June of '69, because I think when they started Electric Lady, selling out arenas the way they were, Jimmy's share of that money was well sufficient to pay what was originally thought to be 600,000 to create the studio. So you're like, okay, I can handle this. I can make this work. But of course, then one thing after another started, and that's when it became such a battle to get the studio finally completed.
Does anybody ever know that if Noel was ever sorry that he left?
Oh, I think so.
Obviously he was already at the top of his game when he left.
Yeah, but I think Noel, it's funny. I think Noel and Mitch are brilliant musicians who really showed their value when they performed with Jimmy and recorded with Jimmy as musicians, right? Yeah. But I also think that they weren't a band that grew up together in high school and one for all for one. And
it's like the Monkees. They were put together. Here you go. Here's your band.
They were put together, right? They were put together, and it worked. And I think Noel saw an opportunity for him to he was a guitarist anyway and wanted to be that. So, I think he jumped ship at a time that I think he thought he would be able to, establish himself. But it just, it didn't work out.
No, the fat mattress never went anywhere. The band never went anywhere. Well, and the other thing about it is you talk about Billy Cox. if they hadn't been in service together, they wouldn't, that's another one of those things that was actually kind of a buddy of his that Billy, Billy and those. And it was funny because Billy was there when I saw him. He came at the kind of the epitome of, I mean, the top of the game when he was selling out all
Yeah.
these arenas, and then he's like, man, I'm playing with Jimi Hendrix. And you're right.
Well, but think about it though. I mean, Jimi Hendrix, like we were talking about earlier. I mean, he had a very tiny network of people he trusted.
Yeah, I'm
He
sure.
could have had any player in the
Oh, yeah.
world,
Yep.
and he went to Billy Cox.
Yeah.
He could have had a rock supergroup. If you think about Blind Faith in the summer of '69,
Yep.
Noel leaves at the end of June '69. And, today you wonder if like a record company would have been pressuring Jimmy to say, hey, get this guy. Think about how big it could be. But he was like, no, I need this guy. This guy's important to me. And then I think when he did Woodstock, he reached back to Larry Lee, another old friend who, had been in Vietnam in more recent months prior to Woodstock. And, so he, when he came back, he joined Jimmy for a short period of time. So that's why I think, Eddie and Billy and Mitch and Jerry Stickles and like that, this is a very small group of people that have Jimmy's ear and Jimmy trusts, and he trusts them in their roles. Now, did that mean Jimmy would be up? He was always up for a jam with anybody. He was always up for a play with anybody. Like all that stuff's great. But if you're talking about his little tight knit group, it was very small.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I understand it because that's the way it usually is. You have a group of people because you got the people that are standing around going, "Oh, you're so great, you're beautiful, you're great, you're great." You got those people all the time, and then you got people that you trust. It's kind of like me when I do stuff. I send it to people I know. You will tell me the truth.
Right. Sure.
You send it to them and go, "Okay, what do you think?" Now you may not like the song, but tell me about the quality. That kind of thing. One other thing I was going to ask you was. What have they done to be able to preserve the tapes? Because I know those things, they deteriorate over years. So how have they been able to maintain them and keep them? I know they've always moved everything to digital, but they still have the analog tapes.
No. We still work all right from the original tapes in what we do. So, I think we're fortunate in that I've done a lot of archival projects with many other artists besides Jimmy, but the manufacturing of recorded tape, as you probably know, changed approximately in 1972 when the kind of the whale oil was part of the glue backing that held oxide onto a tape.
Yeah.
But Jimmy's things were all done prior to that, so we've never had to bake a Jimi Hendrix tape.
Oh, okay, that's what I was going to ask.
So now, granted, there were all kinds of things that went on previous administrations, cutting pieces out and doing things that weren't in the best long-term historical value to Jimi Hendrix, but yeah, no, his stuff is all very carefully stored. We've been through every tape in the library. A big part of what I've done over the last 30 years is to bring back a lot of stuff that had strayed. It's temperature controlled, humidity controlled, but the Hendrix family has its own vault, and his tapes are very carefully looked after.
Well, it's got to be fun to put on the original tape and listen to it and start messing with the board, and start, oh, let me pull this out and that which Eddie did on the film, but to think about that, because we all know when you hear the final product, it's a lot different than when you start taking stuff out and listen to individual tracks. It all comes together at the end. But
what I like about it is that it reveals. That's why the Electric Lady, I think the box set fans will really enjoy, is that Jimmy is very excited. He's up. There's a lot of fun back and forth between him and Eddie in the control room, between him, Mitch, and Billy on the floor. And you just get a sense that there's order for the first time in a while. I do think that's the one thing that Eddie brought, and there's no doubt that at times he and Jimmy bristled over Eddie's trying to keep things in a structured manner. But I think Jimmy appreciated that and worked as he was at his best when he would push the boundaries that Chaz Chandler and then later Eddie Kramer would set for him and say, look, no, let's try this. Now, try anything creatively, Eddie would be down for it. But I also think that if, he felt that things were just meandering and not going, I think he would try to redirect Jimmy back into something productive. Like, hey, you were on to something here. Why don't you come in, have a listen? Let's think about maybe overdubbing this or doing this. And I think that Jimmy, as long as he kind of had the final say, which he deserved as an artist, as the creative force in this.
Right.
I think he appreciated the fact, and I believe it was Dave Palmer that says it, that Eddie cared and Eddie was listening. Like, Eddie is suggesting this not because he's bored and wants to go home, but he's saying that, hey, I've heard you now do this, and I think we can do this if you do that. And I think that would trigger an idea of Jimmy's to say, okay, yeah, I'll come in, we'll put a second guitar part there, and then once he's there and he's listening, he's like, you know what, I could do this. So I think Eddie knew sometimes to be able to turn the wheel just a little bit, and then everything would spin.
Which brings up 2 points. One is the fact that when you have your own studio, you're not beholden to some executive telling you hurry up because I got time. Money, you know what I mean? It's like, as we always called them, the suit guys. Hurry up. We got to get the next deck in. We got to make money. So and I forget, Chaz was the producer of the first album. First two.
Yes.
Was Eddie ever considered a producer in writing? I mean,
not
obviously,
in that time. Absolutely not. Chaz was the boss.
Right.
Chaz was the co-manager and producer and the boss. Eddie and Chaz had a great relationship, tremendous respect both ways. But, Chaz was very hands-on. Remember, when he took Jimmy to London, Jimmy lived with him. Writing songs, Chaz would be sitting across the table saying, think about this. No, you need to do this. So think about this. So I think what Chaz did is he presented to Jimmy the roadmap to navigate the commercial pop of the era. Like, here's how you do it. You know what I mean? Like, Purple Haze can't be 10 minutes long. You need to have this kind of structure.
Yeah, we couldn't play songs like that back then. No, they couldn't do that.
No, but I think that was important to Jimmy to understand, like, okay, I can see where Chaz is trying to go. And then that's what makes Electric Ladyland so great, is that in addition to Crosstown Traffic, you have The Long Voodoo Child, you have Rainy Day Dream Away, Still Raining, Still Dreaming. You have, so I think, where Jimmy was pushing back was like, look, I don't need to be restrained, but I do understand what you're telling me, which is, think about this from a different perspective. But Chaz was very much in charge. By the time Chaz leaves the Electric Ladyland project, the relationship with Eddie is one of trust, but Jimmy, I think, is still in the end, is the decision maker. But I think Eddie freely had the ability where others didn't. I mean, I've listened to every tape in the Hendrix library, and no engineer challenges Jimmy the way Eddie did. None, zero. Wow. They're just putting up tapes, letting it roll, and whatever happens, happens, billing them for the time. But Eddie is always on that talk back saying, let's try it again. You want to try this? You want to do this? Because he understood the successful way that Chaz worked and how that brought a tremendous yield and enthusiasm from Jimmy. So I do think that was a foundation of Eddie's approach as an engineer with Jimmy was, look, we're both serving the song here, but I think you can do it slightly differently, as opposed to, being able to mandate to Jimmy, hey, I don't like this. We're going to change, move to the next song. Eddie could not do that, but he certainly could encourage Jimmy and had Jimmy's ear and respect, where he'd be able to suggest things to him, which would redirect Jimmy to say, okay, I see what you're saying. Let's give it a try.
Kind of a mentor relationship to a certain degree. I mean,
I don't know. I think
because
they were young guys the same age. You know what I mean? I don't think mentor. I think
they were the same age, but yeah.
I'd say this to you, Rick. I think he respected Eddie's knowledge and talent, which is why he was his trusted guy.
Right.
He did not want him to get into areas that he didn't want him in. Like, I don't need to have you telling me about my lyrics or you telling me about this or that, but help me do it better. Absolutely. That he relied on Eddie for that, trusted Eddie for that. Like, yeah, man, we can do that. Like, Billy would say, oh yeah, when we get in the studio, Eddie will take care of that. We can do that. Yeah. Because I think he had that comfort in his mind that don't worry about that. That's a problem that might hurt other artists, but our guys there, continuity is there. We've already discussed this. We don't have to go over it every time with a new guy. Like, this isn't how I like to sing my vocals. I want to do it this way. Like, all that was shorthand to him. He was able to get right to creativity, knowing that Eddie understood, like, okay, this is how I like my amp recorder. This is how I like this done. This is how I like this done. Let's get to work.
And I always have a feeling that there was not a lot of, with Jimmy. Nowadays, they spend time of changing amplifiers, doing this, and, futzing around here. I need a pedal over here. I need this. Let's put some, I just felt that Jimmy always, just like when he performed live, just, not that he didn't overdub. I mean, look, we were talking about Crosstown Traffic, where he uses a kazoo. I mean,
right.
And you're like,
but you're talking about three pedals, three
right.
pedals. Not some huge digital board that looks like a computer on the floor. Talking about three pedals and a Marshall amp, or again, depending on, because a lot of times that Eddie and Jimmy would experiment and have them play through a Fender amp or something like that. But no, mostly it was just the Marshall.
This is why this sits by me all the time. Because of Jimi Hendrix. Because I
without question. I mean, the Univibe, the Octavia, the wah-wah pedal, those are the main tools. But you and I both know it was all in the hands. You know what I mean? That it's the guy, not necessarily the accessories which shaped or colored the sound.
No,
but it's the guy making the sound that was the difference maker.